ladies and gentlemen, the tiny DevOps guy.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first Guatemalan edition of Tiny DevOps. I'm your host, Jonathan Hall. On this show, we like to talk about DevOps for small teams, small companies. And today, as I mentioned, I'm in Guatemala, visiting my wife's family. We're here for a few weeks. So I apologize for the roosters you might be hearing in the background, but that's what's going on. Welcome to the show, roosters. More importantly, though, my guest of honor today is Emily Omier. Hi, Emily. Thanks for coming on.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about what you do. You have kind of a unique value proposition for your business and your consultancy. Tell us what you do and what's unique about the services you offer.
Yeah, so I help open source startups with their positioning. So first of all, open source startups, that's sort of a squishy term, I suppose, but the way that I define it is just any company that is sort of tightly connected to an open source project. Sometimes this means, and the sort of most traditional open source project or open source startup is a open core, so a company that's following an open core strategy. But there's a lot of ways that a company could be connected to an open source project. Sometimes it's a lot more loosely than that we have, an open core strategy. And I help them with positioning. And positioning is basically about determining what label to slap on yourself. And the key is it has to be something that people understand. And it has to highlight the value that you provide, and you, meaning your open source project and whatever thing you do to make money. And you also have to have a relationship between the two that makes sense. And that's one of the unique things about what I do is helping companies figure out how to position both and how to position them in relationship to each other.
That's really fascinating. I can imagine that that's a big challenge. I mean, I've actually worked with a few companies that have an open source component or something like that, and often they kind of have the attitude that if you build it, they will come. And I imagine you see that a lot. Oh, we're going to open source this thing, and everyone's going to want it. Does it ever work like that?
Does it ever work like that? Sort of, maybe, but for the most part. Usually when somebody has a story like that, there's some sort of there's something that they're not telling you, basically. Okay. There's almost always some, the way that I would put it, I know that people don't like to use the word marketing, but you kind of have to tell people that your open source project exists, whether this is just like a side project, or you're building a company around it. Like if you care about getting people to use your open source project, you do have to tell people that it exists. And you have to have it make sense. I mean, there's literally millions of open source projects. I think there's like 8 million on GitHub or something like that. So there's a lot of noise out there. And if somebody doesn't understand what your project is doing, I'm talking like even outside of any outreach, like somebody lands on your README, and if it doesn't make clear why they should care about this project, and by that I mean like, what does this project accomplish, and who is it for? People have short attention spans. If they don't get that in the first 30 seconds, they're off to see if another one is going to meet their needs.
Mm-hmm. How is that different than a non-open source product? If I want to sell an e-course about knitting, I need to make the same points, don't I? Or is it different for open source?
Well, so yes. And first of all, I will say that I don't know. I can't really speak about positioning for a consumer audience because it doesn't really make sense to me. That's not true. It does make sense to me, but it's like a mindset that I don't get. So I'm sure. Pretty hard into the B2B. Honestly, mostly because I'm not much of a consumer myself, so it's hard for me to get into the mindset of somebody making a consumer purchase. Okay. But in terms of the difference between a product and an open source project, so I would say there's not a huge difference between like an open source project and another dev tool. But the thing that you get into with open source projects is that you will always be selling shoes to shoemakers. So your audience will almost always be somebody who is able and will and wants to look under the hood and see what's going on, and likely well, possibly they are not actually able to create the thing that you've created themselves, but they think that they can.
Okay. Yes.
That is a distinction, but that just means like if you're selling software to accountants, that the accountant is never going to be like, oh, I could just do this myself, and I do it so much better. But when you are selling a dev tool, or when you're selling, when you're promoting an open source project, there will always be that aspect in whatever communication you're doing. Especially because, when you're marketing in an open source project, did I just say marketing? Sorry. When you're promoting, I'll use some other word beside marketing. So when you're trying to get people to use your open source project, you aren't just thinking about having people use it, right? You're thinking about getting people involved. Ultimately, you would like to perhaps recruit some more contributors. And you think about things like, contributor ladders and things like that. And in fact, you have to think about what your goal is even before you start positioning, because sometimes the profile of who's going to be a super user isn't the same as somebody who's going to end up contributing back, or who's going to get involved in some other way, just like making comments or attending an event or something like that.
I feel like that concept of selling shoes to shoemakers is something that a lot of technical people try to do even when they shouldn't. In other words, as a practitioner or a developer or an engineer on a team, I approach my product owner or my boss, and I'm trying to sell him things on the technical merits that he probably doesn't care about. He's not a shoemaker. Mm-hmm. How do you address that? Let's start with the open source thing, because often your decision makers, I'm expecting, aren't shoemakers, but they're relying on the opinion of other shoemakers to choose a tool. So suppose you're choosing, a workflow tool or something like that. You want your developers, your engineers to understand it and to be excited about it. But as the decision maker, you may not be technical. So how do you address that without alienating the other shoemakers who are also evaluating the tool? How do you bridge that chasm, if you will?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. So first of all, even if you are selling a technical product to a technical audience, or you're marketing an open source project, all of your audience is going to be software engineers. You really still have to focus on value. And this is a mistake that I see people make. They'll lead with the features, and then they'll say, oh, well, I'm selling shoes to shoemakers, so they really want to know like how many, like how long the laces are or something like that. I might be like winding down the shoemaker analogy soon. Anyway, the point is that even if you're selling a technical product or marketing an open source project to a technical audience, they still care about value, and they still care about the outcome that they get from that project. So when they go to your README, or they go to your website of the open source project, the first thing that they see should be about what outcome they get from using this project. So whether that is, you'll never write another YAML script, or you'll get away from CI lock-in, or I don't know, so whatever your project does, right? They want to know what the thing is that you help them accomplish. And then, so you can't totally neglect talking about how, but nobody will care how you accomplish that goal until they've established what you accomplish. So that's really important, because people need to know what it is that they get out of this project, and they need to understand that really fast, because otherwise they'll just move on. So then next, I wanted to just say it does differ, and this is one of the differences between an open source project and just a commercial product, is there's different adoption patterns. So you wouldn't usually, the whole thing about open source is that anybody can go download it, start using it. And that's usually the adoption pattern, even if you have like a company using an open source project. It's usually that some individual engineers have gotten interested. Maybe they tell their colleagues about it, whatever. They're probably not having to have that business conversation, or at least you as the maintainer of this project aren't having to sell to, or aren't having to, convince non-technical people to use your open source project. That's different when you have a commercial product. Usually when you have a commercial product, you do, at the beginning, you have to bring in the sort of business, the buyer persona, right? And they have different needs, and you have to address those. So the key is, though, so whether you have just an open source project or a commercial product, or both, as with most of the companies I work with, you do have to recognize that there are different stakeholders. And the key is you have to understand what the adoption pattern is for your particular thing. And you want to adjust how you talk about it based on that adoption pattern. So if your adoption pattern is that you have an individual contributor who discovers your open source project, they talk to their boss signs off on it, and now everyone in the organization uses it, then obviously you want to be talking directly to the needs of that individual contributor. On the other hand, if you have a commercial product, usually that is super useful to the boss, and it will usually be the sort of boss persona. And the boss persona actually might not be a non-technical person. We could be talking about like a VP of engineering here. But the bottom line is that somebody like a CTO or a VP of engineering has different needs than an individual contributor. And part of their job is to care more about businessy stuff. And so just as a result of that, you have to be able to make a more business-focused pitch in order for them to really see that this is something that meets their needs. So I'm not even talking about like a totally non-technical person, just that it's somebody who has more business metrics in their job title. So if that is the person that usually is the champion for your product, then you need to speak to that person's needs. On the other hand, you also can't neglect those other stakeholders completely, right? Because you need to make it easy. The individual contributor finds your open source project or finds your product, goes to have a meeting with their boss. Make it easy for that person, right? Have like a website or have like a page on your website that person can send to their boss, or something that they can, like a PDF that they can download and say, look, here's some talking points. Like, make it easy for them. And same goes if you're have a more of a top-down adoption pattern. Ultimately the VP of engineering isn't gonna want to totally force, whip their direct reports or their individual contributors into shape. Like, they want to convince them that this is a good tool. Make it easy for them.
I hear what sounds to me like a lot of parallels with just communication in general. If you're trying to convince your spouse that you want to go to dinner at place X versus Y, you need to convince them the value of going to place X versus Y. Do you have any advice for people who maybe aren't doing open source projects, just to communicate within their team, with their colleagues, with their stakeholders, with their boss, when you're trying to influence a decision somehow? What do you need to focus on? What are the, say, top 2 or 3 things to focus on in that sort of scenario?
Yeah. So actually, I'm glad that you brought the parallels with just in general communication, because it's true. You know, one of the best practices of any sort of communication, especially when you're trying to persuade someone, is understanding what matters to the other person, and what matters to the other person is very likely not the same as what matters to you. And you know, if we talk about this in an employment situation, maybe if they have precisely the same job title and role as you, they might have the same needs, and you don't have to think about it too much. On the other hand, if they have a different job title, and oftentimes, particularly in a DevOps scenario, right, you'd be on one team, but each person has a slightly different responsibility. Well, that means that somebody who is responsible for, let's say, security, that person is evaluated on different metrics than you might be. They are, you have your security person and your app developer, for example. The metrics that they're evaluated on are different. What leads them to get, a promotion is different. What leads them to get fired is different. What just leads them to sort of feel like they've done a really good job in their job is different. And so when you're making a pitch to somebody, you have to consider that. And if you're just making a pitch for, we should use this tool, or we should do X, and you're only talking about reasons why it benefits you or why it benefits somebody like you, that's going to fall really flat. Instead, you have to think about, this is why this is valuable to somebody like you. I'm the app developer talking to the CTO, and I'm saying, this is why it's going to make our whole organization look good. This is why it's going to help us meet XYZ metrics that are the metrics that CEO or CTO are evaluated on. So that's really the core, is understanding, what matters to that person that you're speaking to.
So you need some empathy.
You need to start with empathy. Yes.
Yeah.
And then, there's also the issue of using language that person understands. If you're inside of a technical organization, you can be technical. But yeah, particularly this is going to be the case if you're at a small company, and you're going to be making a lot of these pitches, directly to a business owner, a CEO, and that person probably doesn't really understand a lot of the technical jargon. And that's great. That's not that's not their job to understand the technical jargon. They have a different job. And I say that because I think there's sometimes a tendency to look down on people who don't get the technical stuff. It's not that they're in some ways less capable. It's just they have a different job. They do stuff that probably you can't do, or would struggle to do. But you have to, if you want to make some sort of pitch, you have to make it in the language that they understand. So use the language of business to talk about why this particular, tool is necessary, or why you need to spend, a month rewriting this particular application instead of creating new features, or whatever it is. Talk about things that they care about, which, if you're talking to a business owner, it's all going to be about, this is going to increase our revenue, or this is going to make our customers more happy, or, it's going to make it's going to sort of future proof our application. So we're going to basically have a more stable application that we can rely on for a longer period of time. So you use the language that they'll understand. Don't get into the technical weeds. They don't care.
Back to the topic of open source a little bit here. When you're promoting an open source project, as a company, you're promoting an open source project. There's a lot more, I think, there's a lot more than just getting people to use your software. You probably also want to get people to contribute to your software, for example. That's I think there's at least two different models. I've seen companies where they actively want contributors to their open source project to build a community. others who don't care. They just they make something available, and if you want to contribute, that's fine. But how do you? Let's just start with how do you appeal to potential contributors on an open source project? Is that something you deal with, and how do you approach that?
So first, I wanted to address, like, do you want contributors? And it all comes back to, this is like sort of even more fundamental than thinking about how to position your open source project, but like asking yourself why. Why did you open source this project in the first place? And there's different answers to that question, and there's not necessarily like a right answer and a wrong answer. So you do need to understand that. And then the next piece is, let's say, your goal is community growth. All right. This is a big one for people that are have an open source project. Well, what does community growth mean? There are different ways to define community growth. Like, it could be a growth in number of downloads. That's actually a metric that people will look at, but you don't know how many people are actually using it if it's just that people have downloaded it. It could be the number of active users. It could be the number of people who aren't contributing code back, but are active in the community, like they're asking questions. It could be contributors, and even in some open source projects, it could be that you'd like to recruit another maintainer. So you do have to know how you define community growth, and why this open source project matters in the first place is going to give you clues to which one of those metrics matters the most to you. And like, do you want people contributing code or not? It all depends on what your goals are for the project, for the project, and then also for your product, and how you view them as being interrelated, or not very interrelated. I do usually see that the companies for whom it's very sort of tight, and open source is really, really critical to their identity as a company. Those companies are more likely to be interested in really creating a community, which includes, the code contributions. And I would say it's sort of skewed towards the not just active users, but like active community members, which I think of as people who would like go to an event, make comments in the Slack group, not necessarily contributing code back, but that's also included, like the code contributions, but just like contributions to the community. And then people for whom the open source project is less critical to their identity as a business, they will generally not care so much about those particular metrics, and they're usually looking at like number of users.
Let's take a step back then. You did a good job of reeling me back a little bit, but I want to go back a little bit further and address what are the top most common reasons that a company would choose to open source something, because that's going to feed into we should have done this in reverse order, but that will feed into what we just discussed. But what are the top reasons that a company would choose to do open source?
So the first reason that comes into my head actually is that they can't imagine not doing an open source, which is to say, I work with a lot of companies that are in the infrastructure space and the cloud native space, and they'll basically just say, like, I don't want to get up on a stage, talk about my company, and not have an open source component. Like, I don't feel, I feel like having an open source component it's just table stakes. It's like it's a core part of being credible in this ecosystem. So I don't know. I don't want that to sound like the founders who say that are self-serving. I don't think it's that. It's just that they consider, like, you just kind of have to, like, if you want to play in this space, you have to be open source. There are other reasons. So I think anybody whose goal, sort of their company mission is really about like dominating a very specific type of tool. I don't think you're ever going to totally, dominate the mind share unless there's an open source component. Of course, we're talking about, a tool that software engineers use. I think, you kind of have to have an open source component if you really want to be considered like, the best at X.
Do
Because
you have an example of a tool that fits in that category?
I don't have a good example. There is a company I'm thinking of, but I think should have a better open source strategy, particularly for this reason, because they want to. I'll out them slightly, but anyway, they want to be the place that you go to if you're incorporating a keyboard into your application. And this, it's an excellent idea, but I don't think, in order to really dominate this really specific niche, you have to have an open source, because there's a lot of developers that are going to be looking for something that's open source and disappointed if they don't find it. And so you're almost asking somebody else to come into the market. The next thing I wanted to say is, if your mission is anything about democratizing X, that's sort of the same. And I do talk to a lot of companies that part of their mission is, democratizing X. I just worked with a company recently whose part of their goal is democratizing privacy. So a lot of privacy tools have only been available to really, really huge companies because they're hard to develop, basically. And so they have a privacy tool that software engineers can use, like that developers can use as part of their development process. And there's an open source and a commercial product. And in their case, one of the reasons to have an open source project is because, well, their goal is to democratize access to this kind of tool. And they, like, in order to do that, you like, open source is the way to accomplish that mission.
So those are the two reasons it sounds like that you deal with the most. Is that fair?
No, because then I'm going to get into
No?
the more self-serving ones.
Okay.
I mean, and then there's like open source can also, like, quite honestly, be a marketing play. And people don't like to say this out loud, but I think that this is a real reason that people do open source. And I don't think that people should think of their open source project as like a lead pipeline. There are people out there that definitely do. And then there are people also who just do, open source is like a part of our adoption play. Like, we have people adopt the open source, and then once the CTO finds out, then the CTO decides that that's something we need to pay for. We need to pay for support, and then, bada boom, now we have a new customer. And while I personally don't I don't encourage people to think of their open source project as just a marketing play. I actually think that you get more value out of the open source project, more business value for the company maintaining the open source project if you don't think of it as just a marketing play. But I do think that is how some people think of it.
What about companies that they have a closed source core, but they have an open source, say, SDK or something like that? Is that kind of a special case? Because usually they're just trying to let you integrate with your other stuff without paying licensing fees or something. How does that figure into your business or your thinking on the topic?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit different. I mean, they're not trying to that's a different kind of open source model. And in that case, I would say the open source SDK is just like it's an adoption play. They're trying to make their product more accessible to more people. But you're still going to have to pay if you want to use the product.
What about companies that look for? I don't know if companies do this or more like open source organizations, but if you want to sponsor an open source project, or maybe individual maintainers will do that. You can certainly do that on GitHub these days. You can put up a sponsorship thing, sponsor my package. Is that something you see companies doing, or is that more of a nonprofit individual type approach?
Yeah. So I will say I don't know a ton about this. This is kind of outside outside of my specialty. On the other hand, I don't know zero about it because I should go to conferences and like listen to talks about stuff like this. So from what I have heard, this is definitely a thing that happens, and companies. There's a couple of challenges. First of all, if you are the open source maintainer who's asking for some sort of contribution, there are some types of projects that are more visible than others. And one of the unfortunate things is that a lot of really like fundamental open source projects, the kind of thing that like everybody uses, often they're the least visible to people. They're sort of taken for granted. And so even though it might be like really critical, that often they're less likely to be supported financially. Another takeaway that I had, actually, I went to a talk about this at the Linux Foundation Member Summit. But another takeaway that I had is that it's harder than you expect for a large company to just send money to somebody, because that's not how big companies work. They have to have like a purchase order, and there's like all sorts of implications if they're sending you money. Like, is this a donation to like a nonprofit? Is this a they have to like have you sign paperwork that you're not an employee. I mean, it's not just as simple, often for like a VP of engineering to take out their company card and be like, hey, let's see, who am I going to send money to today? It's often more complicated than that, just from like a bureaucracy perspective. So if you have an open source project and you want to have people send you money, keep those things in mind. And there's some steps you can take to make it easier. I know that there could be things like incorporating a business, or having some sort of document that you can easily send to people who would like to give you money. And then the last thing is, just like make it as easy as possible if you want people to give you money. Companies know. So companies that use open source, like they recognize that they're relying on open source projects, and they don't want them to go away. And this is a challenge, I think, in the open source ecosystem in general. Is and in fact, it's why I think a lot of companies love open core, because they feel confident that this open source project isn't going to go away because there's a company behind it and it's going to be sustainable. But yeah, they like people who use open source, particularly those at large companies, like they're very aware of how critical it is.
I was working with a client recently who was considering open sourcing a very small module of some sort. Their reason was because they could get some sort of corporate sponsorship. I don't remember how it worked, if it was compensation or if it was just somebody going to support the thing or what it was. But they got some sort of sponsorship if they wrote a module and open sourced it. So they were going to do all the work in house. They were going to, and they didn't want to build a community. It wasn't a marketing ploy. It wasn't anything like that. It was just to get to check a box, basically, to get some benefit. So that's one reason I've seen a company recently considering open source. But what are other reasons that maybe listeners should consider or not consider doing open source if they're thinking about it? If they're on the fence, should we open source our product or part of our product? What are the things they should consider in making that decision?
So one aspect that we haven't touched on, and I apologize because I'm like so biased towards the startups scene, but there's a lot of individuals who create open source projects, and that I wish I had statistics. Actually, I'm curious how many what percentage of open source projects are just sort of created by an individual. Um, that I think has a lot of benefits, particularly if you're not super well established in the industry. It can be like a really compelling way to like establish that that you're good at what you do, and it can become sort of a calling card if you're looking for if you're a consultant, if you're looking for consulting gigs, if you're looking for a job. I think that is an excellent reason to have an open source project.
I can attest to that. I have an open source project that's landed me several jobs, so it works. It takes time. It's not a quick turnaround, but yeah, it works.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing about open source, no matter what your open source what your reasons for doing open source, it is not a quick ROI type of thing. Whether you're a startup, and in fact, I think a lot of open source startups are slower to like hit revenue milestones because they're developing two products basically, whereas just a pure closed source is they're focused on just one. I do think that ultimately they can win the race for sure, but the sort of early days it's a slog. And yeah, the same if you're an individual developing an open source project, because you want to upskill yourself, you want to get a better job, whatever. Yeah, it's not going to be immediate for sure. And then another reason that I hear companies open sourcing is actually for recruiting, because and this is like big companies. If it's a non let's see, a company that is not creating developer tools, then often their open source projects will have they'll have a recruitment element to why they're doing it. They see people from the community, and they can sort of use their open source project and people who are involved in that open source project as like a recruiting pipeline. There's another thing, again, for companies that are not necessarily creating a developer facing tool, but an open source project can be a way to collaborate with other people in the industry, that on something that's like table stakes for everyone. And that's certainly a reason that I see it's a very good reason to work on an open source project. It's rarer, I feel like, to have open source projects that are in that category, but I feel like they are a little bit more, I want to say pure, like the pure open source like ethos. When you have a bunch of companies, some of whom may even be competitors, working together on an open source project that solves some sort of like fundamental problem that doesn't add any value to any of their products, but has to be solved. And I just actually spoke with the folks from Open Telemetry, and that's the category that they fall into. So I think that's a very good reason for having an open source project. I guess the thing I just want to impress on everybody is that communication matters, and positioning matters, even if you're dealing with technical products. Software engineers aren't robots; they're humans, and they, you have to talk to them like humans. They have the same sort of human goals as everyone else, and they, if you're trying to get people to use your open source project, or if you're trying to get someone to use your dev tool, like you have to have empathy for who your users and who your buyers are, and make sure that your thing makes sense.
That's the technical part is always the easy part of this job. It gets all the attention, but it's the easy part. It's the communication, the human interaction that's always complicated and trips us up, I think. Well, Emily, how can people get in touch with you if they're interested, if they have an open source project or are considering one and they think you might be able to help them? I know you also have a podcast. Maybe you want to talk about that a little bit. How can we reach out if we want to?
So my website is emilyomier.com. You can find it on the show notes, maybe.
Yes,
but
definitely.
I know my last name's slightly hard to spell. Then I also have a podcast, Cloud Native Startup, and in the podcast I talk to open source maintainers and founders and other people who work in the cloud native and open source ecosystem. Obviously, fairly focused on the startup world. And then I write a blog, positioning open source. I have a couple of webinars out there that are focused on positioning for open source projects. So yeah, that's where I am. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn too. You can connect with me on Twitter, but I'm not very active. So
Okay, great. We'll have all those details in the show notes. Thanks again, Emily, for coming on. It's been a fascinating conversation. We covered a bunch of topics, how to do open source, how to communicate about open source, and in general, it's been fascinating. I really appreciate you taking the time. I understand you have some bread to go catch up with in the oven.
I do.
All right. Well, enjoy your bread. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.
Till next time, everybody.